The amber glow of Edison bulbs cast long shadows across the mahogany bar of O'Malley's Tavern in downtown Boston. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows as the first snowflakes of the season began to fall, each one catching the light from the street lamps before disappearing into the darkness. The year was 1873, and America was still healing from the wounds of civil war while grappling with the rapid industrialization that was transforming the nation. In the far corner of the tavern, away from the boisterous laughter of dock workers and the animated discussions of Harvard professors, two men sat at a weathered oak table. The fireplace crackled nearby, its warmth barely reaching their secluded spot, but neither seemed to mind the chill that hung in the air like an unspoken tension. John Stuart Mill, his graying hair neatly combed and his intelligent eyes reflecting the firelight, nursed a glass of whiskey. Across from him sat Karl Marx, his wild beard unkempt, and his penetrating gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the tavern walls. The contrast between them was striking. Mill, the refined English philosopher in his pressed wool coat, and Marx, the revolutionary German thinker whose rough appearance spoke of years spent in exile and poverty. The meeting had been arranged by a mutual acquaintance, a progressive journalist who believed that the two greatest minds of their generation should engage in dialogue. What he had not anticipated was the philosophical earthquake that would unfold in this humble tavern. Mill took a sip of his whiskey and leaned forward, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to careful deliberation. "Marx, I must say, your recent work has stirred quite the controversy across Europe, but I find myself fundamentally at odds with your conclusions about the nature of human society." Marx looked up from his untouched beer, his eyes sharpening with interest. The German accent colored his English as he responded, "Ah, Mill, the champion of individual liberty speaks. Tell me, how does your precious freedom taste when it is seasoned with the exploitation of the working masses?" The tavern keeper, a burly Irishman with calloused hands, glanced nervously toward their table. He had heard enough political arguments to know when one was brewing, and the intensity in both men's voices suggested this would be no ordinary discussion. Mill's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained calm. "You speak of exploitation, yet you would sacrifice the very essence of what makes us human, our individual autonomy, on the altar of some collective ideal. How can you claim to liberate humanity by enslaving it to the tyranny of the majority?" Marx leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Liberation? You call it liberation when a factory owner can pay starvation wages while accumulating wealth beyond measure? When children work 16-hour days in conditions that would shame a medieval dungeon? Your individual freedom, Mill, is nothing more than the freedom of the powerful to oppress the powerless." The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney, as if the very elements were responding to the heat of their exchange. Around them, the tavern continued its evening rhythm, glasses clinking, conversations flowing, laughter erupting, but the two philosophers had created their own universe of ideas and conflict. Mill straightened in his chair, his refined features hardening with conviction. "And yet, Marx, what you propose is far worse than any temporary injustice. You would create a system where the state determines not just what a man may do, but what he must think, what he may aspire to become. You would turn human beings into mere cogs in your social machine. Temporary injustice?" Marx's voice rose, causing several nearby patrons to glance in their direction. "Tell that to the woman who watches her child die of tuberculosis because she cannot afford medicine, while the factory owner builds his third mansion. Tell that to the man who works himself to death only to see his family thrown into the streets when he can no longer labor." The intensity between them was palpable now, like the charged air before a thunderstorm. Mill's whiskey sat forgotten as he gripped the edge of the table, while Marx's hands had curled into fists on the worn wood surface. "You paint a picture of suffering, and I do not deny its reality," Mill said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, forcing Marx to lean forward to hear him. "But your solution would create a different kind of hell, one where excellence is punished, where innovation is stifled, where the human spirit itself is crushed beneath the weight of enforced equality." Marx's eyes blazed with a fire that seemed to match the hearth beside them. "And your solution? To maintain a system where a few feast while the many starve? Where the accident of birth determines whether a child will become a lord or a laborer? You speak of the human spirit, Mill, but what spirit can flourish when it is chained to poverty and desperation?" The tavern keeper approached their table, ostensibly to refill their glasses, but really to assess whether he needed to intervene before the philosophical debate turned physical. He had seen men come to blows over far less consequential matters than the future of human civilization. Mill nodded his thanks for the fresh whiskey, and took a moment to compose himself before continuing. The question before us, Marx, is not whether injustice exists. It does. The question is whether we believe human beings are capable of moral progress through individual choice and responsibility, or whether we must abandon all faith in human nature and impose virtue from above. Marx raised his beer, his first sip of the evening, and studied Mill over the rim. Individual choice? What choice does a man have when his only options are to work for wages that barely keep him alive or to watch his family starve? What responsibility can he exercise when the system itself is designed to keep him powerless? The snow outside had intensified, and the wind howled against the windows with increasing fury. Inside the tavern, the warmth and light seemed to create a sanctuary where ideas could clash without bloodshed, where two of history's most influential thinkers could wage war with words alone. As the night deepened and their debate intensified, neither man could have imagined that their conversation would capture the essential tension that would define the next century and beyond, the eternal struggle between the desire for individual freedom and the demand for social justice. The fire had burned lower now, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the complexity of Mill's thoughts as he leaned forward, his fingers steepled before him. The tavern had grown quieter as the evening wore on, with only the most dedicated drinkers and philosophers remaining to witness what was becoming an epic battle of ideas. Mill's voice carried the weight of deep conviction as he began to articulate his vision of human society. Marx, you fundamentally misunderstand the nature of freedom. You see it as some luxury available only to the wealthy, but I tell you that liberty is the very foundation upon which all human progress rests. Without the freedom to think, to choose, to fail and try again, we are nothing more than sophisticated animals following instinct. Marx snorted derisively, his fingers drumming against the table. Pretty words, Mill, but they ring hollow when spoken in a world where freedom is rationed according to wealth. Your philosophy is the luxury of those who have never known true want. No, Mill replied firmly, his grey eyes flashing with intensity. My philosophy recognizes that human beings are capable of growth, of moral development, of transcending their circumstances through the exercise of their rational faculties. When you eliminate individual choice, you eliminate the very mechanism by which societies improve themselves. Outside, the wind had picked up even more, rattling the windows as if trying to break into their heated discussion. Mill paused to take a sip of his whiskey, using the moment to gather his thoughts before launching into the heart of his argument. Consider this, Marx. Every great advancement in human knowledge, every breakthrough in science, every work of art that has elevated the human spirit has come from individuals exercising their freedom to think differently, to challenge convention, to pursue their own vision of truth. Your collective society would crush such innovation beneath the weight of conformity. Marx leaned back in his chair, his bushy eyebrows raised skeptically. And how many potential Shakespeares have died in coal mines, Mill? How many would-be scientists have spent their lives breaking their backs in factories instead of breaking new ground in laboratories? Your individual freedom preserves innovation for the few while condemning the many to lives of drudgery. Mill's response came quickly, as if he had been anticipating this very objection. But that is precisely why we need more freedom, not less. The answer to inequality is not to eliminate choice, but to expand it. We must break down the barriers that prevent individuals from rising according to their talents and efforts, not create new barriers in the form of state control. The tavern keeper had begun wiping down tables nearby, clearly hoping to encourage his remaining patrons to finish their discussions and head home. But the two philosophers seemed oblivious to his hints, lost in their intellectual combat. You speak of expanding choice, Marx said, his voice heavy with skepticism. But you ignore the fundamental reality of class struggle. The wealthy will never voluntarily surrender their advantages. The powerful will always use their freedom to suppress the freedom of others. Your faith in individual virtue is touching, but it is naive. Mill stood up abruptly, pacing to the fireplace where he stood with his back to Marx for a moment, staring into the dying flames. When he turned around, his face was illuminated by the orange glow, giving him an almost prophetic appearance. You underestimate the power of moral suasion, Marx. Yes, change is slow when it comes through individual conversion rather than revolution, but it is also more lasting, more genuine. When people choose to do right because they believe it is right, rather than because they are forced to do so, the change touches their very souls. Marx laughed bitterly, a sound that seemed to echo off the tavern's low ceiling. Moral suasion. Tell me, Mill, how long should the working man wait for his oppressor's conscience to awaken? How many generations should suffer in poverty while we wait for the wealthy to experience moral enlightenment? Returning to his seat, Mill leaned forward intensely. The alternative you propose is worse than the disease you seek to cure. When the state controls all economic activity, it inevitably controls all aspects of human life. Political freedom becomes meaningless when economic freedom has been eliminated. You would create a society of slaves, even if you call them comrades. The passion in Mill's voice was unmistakable now, his usual scholarly restraint giving way to genuine fervor. Human beings are not interchangeable units in some grand social machine, Marx. Each person has unique talents, desires, perspectives that contribute to the richness of human experience. Your collectivist vision would reduce this magnificent diversity to grey uniformity. Marx's eyes narrowed as he prepared his counterattack. Diversity? You call it diversity when some children attend universities while others work in mines? When some live in palaces while others huddle in slums? The only diversity your system creates is the diversity of suffering. But Mill was not finished. Rising again, he began to pace, his movement lending energy to his words. Freedom is not just about economic outcomes, Marx. It is about the dignity of choice itself. When a man cannot decide for himself how to live, what to value, whom to associate with, he ceases to be fully human. He becomes merely a subject of whoever holds power. And when a man cannot feed his children, Marx shot back, what dignity does he possess? What choice does he really have? Your freedom is an abstraction that means nothing to those who lack the material foundation to exercise it. Mill stopped his pacing and fixed Marx with an intense stare. Then let us work to provide that material foundation through the expansion of opportunity, not through the elimination of choice. Let us educate all children regardless of their birth. Let us remove legal and social barriers to advancement. Let us trust in human beings' capacity for growth and improvement. The fire had burned down to mere embers now, and the tavern had grown quite cold, but neither man seemed to notice the chill as their debate reached new heights of intensity. Marx stood up as well, his imposing figure creating a stark contrast to Mill's more refined appearance. Your trust is misplaced, Mill, Marx said, his voice carrying decades of studying human societies. The system you defend creates incentives for selfishness, for exploitation, for the few to prosper at the expense of the many. No amount of education or moral exhortation can overcome the structural inequalities built into capitalism itself. Mill's response was swift and passionate, and the system you propose creates incentives for conformity, for mediocrity, for the suppression of excellence in the name of equality. You would level humanity downward rather than lift it upward. You would guarantee that everyone is equally poor rather than giving everyone the chance to become prosperous. The tension between them had reached a crescendo, their fundamental disagreement about human nature laid bare in the dim light of the dying fire. Marx's weathered hands gripped the edge of the table as he rose to his full height, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the tavern floor. The dying embers in the fireplace seemed to flicker in response to his movement, as if even the elements recognized the power of his presence. His voice, when it came, carried the weight of years spent witnessing human suffering. Mill, your eloquent words about individual freedom ring hollow in the ears of a child working 14 hours a day in a textile mill. They offer no comfort to the mother who must choose between feeding her family and paying rent. You speak of dignity and choice, but what dignity exists in a system that treats human beings as mere commodities to be bought and sold? The tavern keeper had given up his subtle hints and now stood openly by the door, but Marx paid him no attention. His focus was entirely on dismantling what he saw as Mill's naive faith in individual liberty. You ask me to trust in human nature, but I have studied that nature far more closely than you have. I have seen how the bourgeoisie, when given the freedom you cherish, use it to extract maximum profit from the labor of others. I have witnessed how they justify this exploitation with the very philosophy you now espouse. Marx began to pace as well, his heavy boots echoing on the wooden floor. Every factory owner claims to believe in individual freedom. The freedom to pay starvation wages, the freedom to force workers into dangerous conditions, the freedom to accumulate wealth while children die of preventable diseases. This is your precious liberty in action, Mill. Mill remained seated, but his knuckles were white as he gripped his whiskey glass. You paint with too broad a brush, Marx. Yes, there are those who abuse their freedom, but abuse their freedom? Marx's voice thundered through the tavern, causing the few remaining patrons to look up from their drinks. This is not abuse of freedom, Mill. This is freedom working exactly as your system intends. The capitalist is free to exploit, and the worker is free to starve. What choice is that? Outside, the snow had begun to accumulate on the windowsills, creating an almost ethereal backdrop to their heated exchange. Marx turned to face the window for a moment, his breath fogging the glass as he spoke more quietly, but with no less intensity. You see, Mill, you make the same error that all defenders of capitalism make. You confuse individual liberty with individual power. The wealthy man has both liberty and power. He can choose how to live, where to travel, what to pursue. The poor man has only the illusion of liberty. He can choose which master to serve, but he cannot choose not to serve. Returning to the table, Marx leaned forward, his piercing eyes fixed on Mill. Your philosophy assumes that all men start from the same position, that they have equal access to education, to opportunity, to the resources necessary to exercise meaningful choice. But this is fantasy, Mill. Society is divided into classes, and class determines destiny far more than individual merit ever could. Mill opened his mouth to respond, but Marx raised his hand, not yet finished with his assault on liberalism. Let me give you a concrete example. Take two children born on the same day in the same city. One is born to a wealthy family, the other to a factory worker. The wealthy child will attend fine schools, learn multiple languages, travel the world, and inherit enough capital to pursue any dream. The poor child will work from age 6, never learn to read properly, and die young from industrial disease. Tell me, Mill, where is the individual freedom in this scenario? The philosopher's words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Mill's usual composure was beginning to crack under the relentless logic of Marx's assault, but the German thinker was far from finished. Your entire philosophy rests on the myth of individual responsibility, Marx continued, his voice rising with passion. You blame the poor for their poverty, as if they chose their circumstances. You credit the rich for their wealth, as if they earned it through superior virtue. But strip away this mythology and what do you find? You find that wealth comes from ownership of capital, not from individual merit. You find that poverty comes from lack of capital, not from individual failing. Marx returned to his seat but remained on the edge of it, his body coiled with energy. The factory owner does not work 100 times harder than his employees, Mill. He does not possess 100 times more talent or virtue. He simply owns the means of production, and this ownership allows him to appropriate the surplus value created by others' labor. This is not individual achievement. This is systematic exploitation. The tavern had grown quiet except for their voices, the other patrons having either left or fallen silent to listen to the extraordinary debate unfolding before them. Marx's next words seemed to reverberate off the walls themselves. You speak of moral progress through individual choice, but you ignore the material conditions that shape consciousness itself. How can a man develop noble sentiments when he is constantly worried about his next meal? How can he pursue higher learning when he must work from dawn to dusk simply to survive? Your individual freedom requires a material foundation that capitalism denies to the majority of humanity. Mill tried to interject, but Marx pressed on, his voice now carrying a prophetic quality that seemed to transform the humble tavern into a philosophical battleground. The truth you refuse to acknowledge, Mill, is that individual freedom and social equality are not opposing values, they are complementary ones. True freedom cannot exist in a society where the many are enslaved to the few through economic necessity. Real liberty requires that all people have access to the resources necessary to develop their human potential. Marx stood again, his imposing figure seeming to fill the space around their table. Your mistake is thinking that freedom means the absence of collective action. But I tell you that only through collective action can true individual freedom be achieved. Only when the working class unites to overthrow the capitalist system can each person be free to pursue their genuine interests rather than being forced to sell their labor to survive. The fire had died to barely glowing coals now, but the heat between the two men seemed to warm the entire tavern. Marx's final words of this portion of the debate carried the weight of absolute conviction. You fear that social equality will destroy individual excellence, Mill, but what excellence exists now? The excellence of a few parasites who live off the labor of others. The excellence of a system that wastes human potential on a massive scale. I propose a society where every child can develop their talents, where every person can contribute according to their abilities, where excellence serves humanity rather than exploitation. That, Mill, is true freedom. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the whistle of wind through the tavern's eaves and the distant sound of snow against the windows. The tavern had grown cold and dim, with only the faintest glow from the dying embers casting ghostly shadows on the walls. The few remaining patrons had long since departed, leaving only the tavern keeper, who sat resigned at the bar, and the two philosophers locked in their momentous debate. The snow outside had thickened into a proper blizzard, as if nature itself was isolating them for this final confrontation of ideas. Mill sat back in his chair for a long moment, his refined features etched with deep concentration. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that seemed to reflect not just the late hour, but the weight of defending principles he held sacred against Marx's relentless assault. Marx, your passion is admirable, and your concern for human suffering is genuine, but you make a fundamental error that undermines everything you propose. You assume that human beings will behave differently under socialism than they do under capitalism, but you provide no mechanism for this transformation except force. Rising slowly, Mill moved to the window, where he could see the snow swirling in the lamplight outside. You speak of collective action as if it eliminates the problem of power, but it merely concentrates that power in different hands. Instead of wealthy individuals controlling economic life, you would have government bureaucrats making those decisions. How is this an improvement? Marx leaned forward, his eyes blazing with the fervor of a true believer. Because, Mill, those bureaucrats would be accountable to the people, not to private profit. Because the decisions would be made democratically, not by a tiny elite pursuing their own interests. Mill turned from the window, his expression skeptical. Democratically? By whom? You assume that the working class, once in power, will somehow be immune to the corruptions of power that you say inevitably affect the wealthy. But power corrupts regardless of the class that wields it, Marx. Your revolution would simply create a new class of oppressors. The wind howled against the building, and for a moment both men were silent, as if the storm outside reflected the turbulence of their intellectual struggle. When Marx spoke again, his voice carried a note of frustration. You cling to your pessimism about human nature, Mill, because it justifies maintaining the status quo. Yes, power can corrupt, but at least under socialism, power would be distributed among the many rather than concentrated among the few. At least the potential for abuse would be minimized rather than institutionalized. Mill returned to the table, but remained standing, his hands resting on the back of his chair. Distributed among the many, or concentrated in the hands of those who claim to speak for the many? History shows us, Marx, that revolutionary movements quickly develop their own hierarchies, their own privileged classes. Your proletarian paradise would become a bureaucratic nightmare. And your solution? Marx demanded, his voice rising despite the late hour. To accept indefinitely a system where children work themselves to death so that factory owners can live in luxury? To maintain forever the division between those who own and those who are owned? At least my system offers hope for change, Mill. Yours offers only the perpetuation of misery for the majority. Mill's response came swiftly, his scholarly composure finally giving way to real anger. My system offers the possibility of gradual improvement through individual initiative and collective wisdom. Your system offers the certainty of disaster through revolutionary upheaval and centralized control. You would burn down civilization in the hope of building something better from the ashes. The tavern keeper looked up nervously at the raised voices, but neither philosopher paid him any attention. Their debate had reached a crescendo of mutual incomprehension, each man certain of his own righteousness and frustrated by his opponent's blindness. Marx stood as well, the two men now facing each other across the small table like generals planning a campaign. Gradual improvement? For whom, Mill? For the factory owner who might eventually decide to reduce working hours from 16 to 14. For the child who might live to see 12 instead of dying at 10. Your gradualism is a luxury purchased with other people's blood. And your revolution? Mill shot back, his voice sharp with indignation. What guarantee do you offer that your new system will be any better? What evidence do you have that human nature will be transformed by changing economic arrangements? You offer nothing but utopian promises, backed by the threat of violence. Marx slammed his fist on the table, making their glasses jump. At least I offer change, Mill. At least I acknowledge that the current system is fundamentally unjust and must be overthrown. You would have us wait forever for the oppressors to voluntarily surrender their advantages, for the exploiters to develop consciences, for the impossible to become possible through moral suasion alone. The confrontation had reached its peak, and for a moment it seemed as if the two great minds might come to physical blows. But then Mill stepped back, his anger cooling as quickly as it had flared, replaced by something approaching sadness. Perhaps, Marx, we are both right and both wrong. Perhaps human society is too complex to be perfected by any single philosophy, whether it emphasizes individual freedom or collective equality. Perhaps the best we can hope for is a constant struggle to balance these competing values, never achieving perfection, but always striving for improvement. Marx's own anger seemed to drain away as well, replaced by a kind of philosophical exhaustion. No, Mill, that is the counsel of despair disguised as wisdom. If we cannot envision a better world, if we cannot work toward fundamental change, then we condemn future generations to repeat the mistakes of the present. Some struggles are too important for compromise. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of their disagreement settling between them like a chasm that could not be bridged. Outside, the blizzard continued its assault on the windows, and the tavern keeper began to clear his throat meaningfully. Mill extended his hand across the table, and after a moment's hesitation, Marx grasped it. "We may never agree, Marx, but I respect your passion for justice even if I cannot accept your methods." Marx nodded grimly. "And I respect your faith in human dignity, Mill, even if I believe it to be misplaced. Perhaps history will judge which of us saw more clearly into the human heart." As they gathered their coats and prepared to venture into the storm, neither man could have predicted that their debate would continue to rage long after they were gone, that future generations would still grapple with the fundamental tension between individual liberty and social equality, that the questions they had raised in a Boston tavern would shape the political struggles of centuries to come. The tavern keeper watched them leave, shaking his head at the intensity of their discussion. He had no way of knowing that he had just witnessed one of the most important philosophical debates in human history, conducted not in lecture halls or academic journals, but in the humble setting of a neighborhood tavern on a snowy October night. Outside, the two philosophers parted ways at the door, Mill heading toward his hotel near Harvard Square, Marx toward the boarding house where he was staying during his American visit. The snow continued to fall, covering their footprints almost as soon as they made them, but the ideas they had exchanged would endure far longer than any physical trace of their presence. The great debate between individual freedom and social equality would continue in different forms and different settings as long as human beings struggled to create just societies. And somewhere in that struggle, the spirits of Mill and Marx would continue their eternal argument, each convinced of his own righteousness, each blind to the partial truth contained in his opponent's vision.